There is a room that existed in Jerusalem for nearly 400 years. A perfect pew, 10 meters on every side. No window, no lamp, no natural light. Inside that room stood one object, a gold-covered chest flanked by two winged figures whose faces were turned downward, as if they could not bear to look directly at what rested between them. This was the Holy of Holies, the single coordinate on earth where heaven and ground touched, the place where God chose to dwell among men. And for 55 years, a carved image of a fertility goddess stood in that room beside the Ark of the Covenant, placed there not by an enemy, not by an invader, by the King of God's own people. But this was only the end of the story. The beginning was far more subtle. It started with a farmer looking at the sky, wondering if the rain would come. And it ended with drums beating in a valley outside the city walls, loud enough to cover the sound of children screaming. Three gods infiltrated Israel across 7 centuries. One corrupted their economics. One corrupted their understanding of who God was. And one corrupted their humanity beyond recognition. This is the story of Baal, Asherah, and Molech. And it is the story of how compromise never stays small. To understand how a nation chosen by God ended up burning its children in a valley, you need to understand one thing first. Israel had never farmed. For 40 years in the Sinai wilderness, God had provided everything. Manna appeared on the ground each morning like frost. Water broke from solid rock at the strike of a staff. Their sandals never wore out. Their clothes never thinned. An entire generation grew up in a world where survival depended on exactly one relationship: the God who walked ahead of them as a pillar of cloud. Then they crossed the Jordan. Joshua chapter 5 records what happened next with devastating brevity. The day after they ate the produce of the land, the manna stopped. It never came again. Imagine that shift. Yesterday, food appeared on the ground. Today, you stand in a field holding a seed you have never planted, staring at a sky you have never needed. And your family's survival now depends on something you cannot control: rain. And every one of your new neighbors has been farming this land for centuries. They have a system. They have rituals. And they have a God they say controls the rain. This is the detail that changes everything about how you read the Old Testament. The gods of Canaan were not superstitions. They were technologies. They were the ancient equivalent of crop insurance, economic infrastructure dressed in religious language. Baal promised rain. Asherah promised fertile wombs. The entire Canaanite system operated on a single principle: perform the correct ritual, receive the guaranteed result. It was transactional, predictable, measurable, and it had been running successfully in the minds of its practitioners for centuries before Israel arrived. Israel did not abandon God overnight. The book of Judges records something far more disturbing. They served Yahweh and the Baals at the same time. They kept the feasts, they maintained the tabernacle, and they also quietly maintained a few altars on the hillsides. Just in case. There is a Hebrew word that God uses for this behavior, and it is not the word you might expect. The word is zana. It does not mean disobedience. It does not mean rebellion. Zana means adultery. Throughout the prophets, God describes Israel's idol worship not as a crime, but as a betrayal of intimacy. He calls himself the husband. He calls Israel the bride. And he calls every hilltop altar an act of unfaithfulness. This language is deliberate. God is not saying Israel broke a rule. He is saying Israel broke a heart. And that distinction shapes every chapter of the tragedy that follows. The name Baal means simply Lord or Master. In the Hebrew text, it appears over 90 times, more than any other foreign deity in the entire Old Testament. That frequency alone tells you something. This was not a minor nuisance. This was the dominant spiritual rival to Yahweh for the entire duration of the monarchy. Baal-Hadad, the storm god, was called the rider of the clouds. He was the one who split the sky and sent the rain. In a world where a single failed rainy season meant starvation, Baal was not a religious curiosity. He was an economic necessity, or so it seemed. For 3 centuries after the conquest, Baal worship operated at the folk level, small shrines, roadside altars, local priests offering rain rituals on hilltops across the countryside. The prophets condemned it. The judges fought it. But it persisted, the way a low-grade infection persists in a body that never fully recovers. Then, in 874 BC, everything changed with a single marriage. King Ahab of Israel married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31 introduces this marriage with a phrase that is easy to miss, but impossible to overstate, as though it were a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam. The writer is telling you, what came before was trivial compared to what this woman brought through the palace gates. Jezebel did not arrive as a queen quietly maintaining her private devotion. She arrived as an evangelist for Baal. She brought 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, all funded from the royal treasury. She commissioned the construction of a state temple to Baal in the capital city. And she began the systematic assassination of the prophets of Yahweh. Understand what happened. For the first time in Israel's history, Baal worship was no longer a folk practice tolerated on the margins. It was government policy. It had institutional funding, a professional clergy, and royal enforcement. A God of Israel was being replaced by the board of directors. Into this crisis stepped one man, a prophet from Tishbin Gilead, about whom the text offers almost nothing. No genealogy, no education, no title, just a name Elijah, meaning my God is Yahweh, and a declaration, there will be no rain except at my word. 3.5 years of drought followed. Crops collapsed, livestock died, rivers turned to dust. Every rainless day was a public indictment of the God whose only job was to send rain. When Elijah finally called the confrontation on Mount Carmel, the terms were stark. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. The God who answers with fire is the true God. 450 priests of Baal against one man. The priests of Baal went first. They called on their God from morning until noon. They danced around the altar. They cut themselves with knives until blood ran down their arms. They screamed themselves hoarse. the sky said nothing. Then Elijah repaired the broken altar of Yahweh. He used 12 stones, one for each tribe of a nation that had fractured itself chasing other gods. He drenched the sacrifice with water, 12 jars full, until the trench around it overflowed. And he prayed a single prayer. In the Hebrew, it is 33 words. The fire fell. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and the water. The 450 prophets were seized. And that same evening, the rain returned. But here is what makes Carmel so devastating in retrospect. It did not work. Within 1 generation, every altar was rebuilt. The archaeological record confirms Baal worship persisting across Israel for another century after Carmel. The most spectacular miracle in prophetic history produced no lasting change, because Baal was never really about rain. Baal was about the human refusal to live in dependence on a God you cannot control. The farmer who hedged his bets with a hilltop altar was not stupid. He was afraid. And fear, unlike an altar, cannot be consumed by fire. Baal operated in the open. He was loud, public, and unmistakable. The second deity was nothing like him. Her name was Asherah, and she did not attack from the hilltop. She entered through the kitchen door. Asherah was the mother goddess of the Canaanite world, the goddess of fertility, of the sea, of life itself. Where Baal was thunder and spectacle, Asherah was quiet and domestic. She was represented by wooden poles planted beside altars, by stylized trees carved into household objects, and by small clay figurines. Archaeologists have recovered these figurines by the thousands from Israelite homes, not Canaanite homes. Israelite homes. When archaeologists excavate Iron Age Israelite settlements, they find something troubling. Small terracotta figures of a woman holding her breasts. They find them not in temples, not in ritual spaces, in kitchens, in storage rooms, in the corners of ordinary houses. These were not collector's items. These were objects of daily devotion. A woman pressing bread dough at dawn would glance at the figure on the shelf the way a person today might glance at a motivational quote on the wall, without thinking, without questioning. The prophet Jeremiah captures the scene with a description that is chilling precisely because of how ordinary it sounds. The children gather the wood. The fathers kindle the fire. The women knead the dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. This is not a cult meeting in a dark cave. This is Sunday morning breakfast. The entire family participating in a rhythm so familiar that no one in the house thinks of it as idolatry, because no one in the house remembers a time when it was not there. In 1975, archaeologists excavating a remote desert way station called Kuntillet Ajrud in the northern Sinai discovered inscriptions on large ceramic storage jars. The site dated to approximately 800 BC. Among the inscriptions, written in Paleo-Hebrew script by Israelite travelers, was a phrase that has generated scholarly debate for 5 decades. 8 words that exposed the depth of Israel's spiritual corruption. The inscription read, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria, and his Asherah, a possessive pronoun attached to God. These were not Canaanites writing. These were not pagans. These were Israelites, children of the covenant. They had over the generations so thoroughly blended the worship of Yahweh with the worship of the fertility goddess that they no longer saw a distinction. In their understanding, Asherah was God's wife. They had not abandoned Yahweh. They had edited him. They had given the God of Sinai a consort, softened the edges of his jealousy, domesticated his holiness, and made him more comfortable to live with. They did not reject God. They redesigned him. At Tel Arad in the Negev desert, archaeologists uncovered a fully functioning Israelite temple dating to the 8th century BC. It had a Holy of Holies. It had an altar. It had standing stones. And next to the incense altars, they found 2 standing stones, one larger and one smaller, positioned side by side. Scholars believe these stones represented Yahweh and Asherah, standing together in an official Israelite temple. At some point, the temple was deliberately dismantled, and the altars were laid on their sides and buried. But the fact remains. For decades, possibly a century, a sanctioned Israelite temple operated with Asherah worship built into its architecture. Everything I have described so far happened on the margins, in kitchens, at desert outposts, in provincial temples. But what King Manasseh did brought the corruption to the one place it should never have reached. He placed a carved image of Asherah inside the Holy of Holies, inside the temple Solomon had built, inside the room that contained the Ark of the Covenant. To understand what this means, you need to understand what that room was. The Holy of Holies was not simply the most important room in the building. It was the most sacred physical space in the created world. Only one human being could enter it, the high priest, only once per year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. After days of ritual purification, carrying blood in one hand and incense in the other, moving in prescribed sequence, knowing that the bells sewn into the hem of his robe were not decoration. They were a signal. As long as the priests outside heard ringing, the high priest was still alive. That room, that specific room, Manasseh turned into a shared apartment, and the roommate was a Canaanite goddess. For 55 years, that carved image stood in the presence of God. 55 years of Yom Kippur, with the high priest entering the most sacred space in creation and finding a fertility idol standing next to the mercy seat. And God did not send fire. The temple did not collapse. The priesthood continued. The sacrifices were offered on schedule. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. But something had changed in that room that no ceremony could repair. The holy had been asked to coexist with the common. The eternal had been asked to share space with the invented. And the most devastating part is that no one seemed to notice. Asherah did not look like idolatry. She looked like family tradition. She looked like the normal thing everyone around you was doing. She looked like a small addition that made faith a little easier, a little softer, a little more manageable. The king endorsed it. The priests tolerated it. Your neighbors practiced it. Your children grew up assuming it was right. How many things in your spiritual life right now exist not because God asked for them, but because the culture around you normalized them? How much of what you call faith is actually comfort, dressed in religious language? Sit with that question, because what comes next is the darkest chapter in this story. And it happens specifically because not enough people asked that question early enough. The third god did not want rain rituals. He did not want wooden poles or clay figurines or cakes baked for the Queen of Heaven. The third god had a different currency entirely. His name was Molech, and his price was flesh. The name comes from the same Semitic root as the Hebrew word for king, Melech, but the vowels have been altered. Scholars believe the biblical writers deliberately inserted the vowels from the Hebrew word bashet, meaning shame, into the consonants of his name. They would not even write his name correctly. They wrote it with the vowels of disgrace. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21 states the prohibition with a directness that should stop every reader. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. God does not prohibit what no one is doing. The site where this worship occurred lay in a valley just south of Jerusalem's walls. The valley was called Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, and within it was a specific installation called the Tophet. The word Tophet is derived from Toph, the Hebrew word for drum. The drums were not ceremonial. They were not musical. They existed for one purpose, to cover a sound. Not the sound of the fire, the sound that came from the fire. The sound that parents could not be allowed to hear, because if they heard it, they might stop. The first Israelite king documented performing this sacrifice was Ahaz, a descendant of David, a man sitting on the throne of God's covenant line. He burned his sons in the valley of the son of Hinnom, not his enemies, not prisoners of war. His sons. How does a father walk into a valley carrying the child he used to carry on his shoulders? The child whose laughter he memorized? The child he watched sleep? He walks because he has been told this is the price. This is the premium that Baal could not guarantee and Asherah could not secure. The ultimate investment. The final transaction in an economic theology that started with grain and oil on a hilltop and followed its own logic, generation after generation, to the only thing left to give. And this is the truth that no one wants to hear. No nation arrives at Molech without first passing through Baal. The farmer who placed a small altar on a hilltop 3 centuries earlier did not intend this. He was just hedging his bets. He was just being practical. He was just making a small concession to keep his family fed. But compromise is never a destination. It is always a road, and roads lead somewhere. Baal taught Israel that God could be managed through transaction. Asherah taught Israel that God could be reshaped for comfort. And Molech taught Israel that there is no limit to what a transactional religion will eventually demand. Once you accept the premise that the divine can be bought, the only remaining question is the price. And the price always goes up. The prophet Jeremiah records God's reaction to the Tophet, and the language is unlike almost anything else in Scripture. They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to offer up their sons and daughters to Molech, though I did not command them, nor did it enter into my mind that they should do this abomination. Read that last phrase again. nor did it enter into my mind. This is the Creator of the universe, saying that the sacrifice of children was so alien to his nature that he cannot locate the origin of the idea within himself. He did not conceive of it. He did not anticipate it. He watched it happen in the valley outside the city he had chosen as his own, and his first response was not wrath. It was incomprehension. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylon after the fall of Jerusalem, is given a vision that is the most heartbreaking sequence in the entire Old Testament. He watches the kavod, the visible, luminous glory of God that had inhabited the temple since the day Solomon dedicated it, begin to move. The glory rises from above the cherubim. It moves to the threshold of the temple and pauses there, like someone standing in the doorway of a home they built with their own hands, looking back one last time at the rooms they filled with presents, knowing they will not return. Then it moves to the east gate. It pauses again. Then it rises to the Mount of Olives, east of the city. One final look at Jerusalem. And then it is gone. No thunder, no earthquake, no dramatic declaration. Just absence. The most devastating judgment God ever rendered against Israel was not a plague, not an army, not a flood. It was his departure. He simply left. The temple continued to function. Priests still performed their duties. Sacrifices were still offered on schedule. From the outside, the religion of Israel looked completely intact. But the building had been vacated. When Nebuchadnezzar's army burned it to the ground a few years later, they were destroying a structure that had already been emptied of the only thing that made it sacred. After the Babylonian exile, the Valley of Hinnom was never rebuilt. It became Jerusalem's garbage dump. Fires burned there continuously. Worms fed on what the flames did not reach. Smoke rose from it day and night. In Greek, the name Gehenna became one word, Gehenna. In the New Testament, that word appears 12 times. 11 of those 12 come from the lips of Jesus Christ. It is the word he chose for final, permanent separation from God. Every person in his audience knew exactly what he was pointing at. They had walked past that valley. They had smelled the smoke. Some of their great-grandparents had heard the drums. Jesus did not invent an abstract concept of judgment. He pointed at a real place and said, "The valley where your ancestors did the worst thing in human history. That is what it looks like to be permanently separated from the God who built you." The valley where Israel sacrificed its children became the word the Son of God chose for hell. That is not a coincidence. It is a theological statement compressed into a single word. 570 years after the glory departed, a man stood on that same mountain. He came from Galilee. He rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, while crowds laid cloaks on the road before him. And when he reached the Mount of Olives, the same ridge where Ezekiel watched the glory pause for one final look, he stopped, and he wept. The Greek word Luke uses is not quiet tears. It is klausis. It means he sobbed aloud. The glory that had departed from the east gate came back, with a human face, with human tears, to the same mountain, looking at the same city. But this time, instead of leaving in silence, it wept for what Jerusalem had become and for what was coming. The same God who walked away walked back, carrying the weight of every hilltop altar, every kitchen figurine, every year that carved image stood in his holy room, every child offered in the valley below. He carried it all, not to the Tophet, to the cross. These three gods did not die when Babylon fell. They adapted. They changed their names and kept their architecture. Baal lives wherever faith is reduced to transaction, wherever God is treated as a vendor who owes you results in exchange for your rituals, wherever the measure of divine favor is the size of your income. Asherah lives wherever God is quietly reshaped to fit human preference, wherever the uncomfortable demands of Scripture are set aside in favor of a deity who affirms everything and challenges nothing, wherever holiness is traded for relevance. Molech lives wherever innocence is sacrificed on the altar of ambition, convenience, or fear, not always in fire, not always in a valley, but the structure is the same. Something precious, offered up to something that promised security and delivered ashes. The names changed, the altars did not, and the road from a small compromise to an empty temple is shorter than any of us want to believe. Baal corrupted the economics of faith. Asherah corrupted the identity of God. Molech corrupted humanity itself. Three gods, three stages of the same disease. And the cure was never a reform or a revival. The cure was a person,